All right, thanks everybody. Please go ahead and take your seats. We'll go ahead and start our next session. Both of our keynote speakers are on a very tight schedule, so Secretary Gates has to leave right away, and our next guest will have to leave immediately following this session. She's got a important engagement up in Dallas. But I could not be happier to introduce you to our second keynote guest, Dr. Kori Schake. And in my mind, this is the perfect complement to Secretary Gates. Both of them have done so much for the work of national security in the United States. Kori does not date back to the LBJ days. Her first experiences were with Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. She's a senior fellow and the director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She has worked in high policy with a distinguished career in the State Department, the department formerly known as Defense, and the National Security Council. So all the big three that all of our students want to join as they leave the University of Texas. She's been a steward of higher education, teaching at Stanford, West Point, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the University of Maryland, and she assists with our own program every July in Beaver Creek, where we convene about 20 PhD students from across the country and across the world to educate them on strategy and national security. She's also a scholar and author, most recently publishing The State and the Soldier, a history of civil-military relations in the United States. Her public commentary is always insightful, and her expert counsel is always in high demand. And my personal observation, and it's not my own, but certainly personal, is that she elevates intellects and spirits everywhere. She's an inspirational leader and always welcome here in Texas and at the Clements Center and Strauss Center in our activities. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Kori Schake.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm super grateful to whoever did the scheduling to put me in the wake of Secretary Gates. That's really fun.
So we haven't had you to campus probably in a few years, so maybe just a little bit of catch-up first. Normally the question would be, what are you working on now? But a better question is, you have just finished working on something and now you're out on the book tour just in the first couple of weeks. So can you tell us a little bit about where you're at now with your last project?
Sure. There wasn't a basic history of how it is the United States, a country founded in fear of a standing army, right? 13 of the 85 Federalist Papers are actually attempting to persuade Americans that the country they were forming should have the ability to defend itself. It was that much in contention. It was the largest fear that the founders had, because of course there hadn't been a military in 1,000 years that hadn't overturned a civil government. And so I wanted to tell the story of how we get from fear of a standing army to thinking about our military as a major bulwark of American democracy. So the book starts with George Washington, and it works forward to 2025.
And why is it popular right now?
The Secretary of Defense is basically my publicist at this point in time, with the pressure that the Trump administration is putting on the professional and nonpartisan nature of the American military. There hasn't been this much pressure to create a military that's a political force in American politics. It hasn't been under that much pressure since 1867. Can I tell the story of Grant?
Yes, absolutely.
It's my favorite thing I learned in the book. So Ulysses Grant, after the Civil War, was this senior American officer. And after President Andrew Johnson comes to power, after Lincoln's assassination, he and Congress are very quickly on a collision course over reconstruction of the formerly seceded states. And The Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. President Johnson vetoed them. They passed the 3 Reconstruction legislation. President Johnson vetoed them. They overrode the vetoes. The president got impeached by the Congress for refusing to carry out the law. The president was threatening to disband Congress. Congress was threatening to arrest the president. And into this was thrust General Grant, because Congress passed legislation saying it was illegal for the president to fire either the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, or General Grant. President Johnson fired Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and appointed Grant simultaneously the senior military officer and the senior civilian in the Department of War. Congress threatened General Grant with 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine if he accepted the position. President Johnson offered to serve the jail time and pay the fine if General Grant would uphold the constitutional authority of the president's ability to direct the military. General Grant appealed to the Attorney General, saying that the president had no authority to issue non-military orders to the military. The Attorney General upheld Grant's objection to the president, and then Grant had to choose between the 2 constitutionally authorized sources of civilian control of the military about whether he should accept Edwin Stanton's job. And I think it's really relevant in our current political moment that General Grant made, while no military officer should have been thrust in that position, General Grant made the incredibly consequential decision, based on the Attorney General's guidance, that in peacetime, it is Congress that has the supreme civilian authority over the military, not the commander-in-chief.
How has that resonated from Grant forward?
So nobody since General Grant's been thrust in that position, but in the first Trump term, I'm quite critical of many of the choices the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, made in the Trump and Biden administrations, because I think he opened a window of vulnerability for the military to be thrust into these kinds of positions. But General Milley should have been demanding to be judged by Olympic diving standards, right? A degree of difficulty factored into his score. And I think General Kane should be, and many other in the military leadership, should be asking to be graded like Olympic diving too, right? Because what the president is doing, firing so many, squandering so much of the senior military talent with unexplained firings, holding political rallies in front of troops, encouraging the military to behave in partisan ways, pardoning officers who had been convicted by courts martial of insubordination or of war crimes, appointing people to senior civilian positions in the Department of Defense who had been drummed out of military service for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. These are really dangerous efforts to politicize the American military. And the way the president is employing National Guard and active duty in a law enforcement environment, I think bodes very ill for the relationship, for the affectionate relationship between the American public and our military.
Thanks very much. And we'll probably come back to some of these things as we go, but I wanted to give you a chance to tell us, update us, and even brag about some of the work of your staff, right? Can you tell us
my favorite topic.
What if we're not we're not routine readers of national affairs or have been missing something, what should we know about the publications and the work of your staff?
So I have the great good fortune to be the captain of a pirate ship of 70 foreign and defense policy analysts at the American Enterprise Institute. And they are journalists, political scientists, historians, and three of my favorite pieces of work are all from the defense team right now. The first is Elaine McCusker, who was a former acting comptroller of the Defense Department. So she has supervised an $850 billion a year budget. She went through the budget a year ago, line by line, in all of that money in what's called the J Book. And she identified three different categories of spending. The first category was what it takes to bring and keep people who can fight and win the nation's wars into service. The second category was the benefits which are important for recruiting and retaining those kind of people. A third category was sort of marginal, we can't really tell, but the fourth category was things that are in the defense budget because it's the only piece of legislation that can be relied on to pass in the congressional fun and games that Bob Gates was referring to. Would anybody care to guess what proportion of the US defense budget includes things like breast cancer research, green vehicles, things that are good things for the nation to invest in but have nothing to do with fighting and winning the nation's wars? $1.07 in the defense budget has nothing to do with the defense enterprise, because it's legislation that Congress will pass when they will not pass other legislation. So Elaine figured that out, and I think that's really important. When Secretary Gates was saying there are things you can cut out of the defense budget, my team has been advocating to the Trump administration a number of reforms they can make to the defense enterprise to improve the performance. The second piece of work I'm really proud of, Secretary Hegseth gave a speech on defense acquisition reform last Friday, and it was baldly plagiarized from the work of Bill Greenwald and John Ferrari in my team, which is what effective policy advising from outside the government looks like, right? We're thrilled that the Secretary of Defense plagiarized our work because that means it became policy. And the third piece of work I'm really proud of, Todd Harrison, who's an expert on space policy and also on budget. He built a software program for our team that allows you to do the crosswalk between strategy and force structure and budgets. And he took the president's announcement about the desire to build a golden dome of defense, missile, cruise, and drone defenses over the entirety of the continental United States. And he costed out what 4 different versions of that might look like. A minimalist version that would be able to handle onesies and twosies, everything from that to what the president said it's going to do, which is protect the entirety of the continental United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and American possessions. The top end of that scale, so the president has said he's going to commit $175 billion to this. The low end of Todd's budgeting is almost twice that. The high end of those 4 different force structures is $3.4 trillion and a generation of technological improvement. So it would be a beautiful thing if we could actually protect the United States that way. We're a long way from having the ability to do it. And he did not just the arithmetic, but the programmatics to show what those alternatives look like. Right. And so I think that's great work that students here should aspire to do for their country.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. So turning to today's theme, Beyond the Battlefield, you've worked in all the major offices of the executive branch that set the course for and execute diplomatic and military affairs and strategy. So what are your observations on the complementary roles of military and non-military components of power and influence?
So I still like Jim Mattis's reflection on this, which is, he said if you're going to cut the State Department's budget, you have to buy the military more bullets. I think the complementarity is fundamental. And I agree with everything Secretary Gates said about the way we are denuding all of the military elements of the American government's ability to affect and advance our interests in the world. So there's a terrible novel from the late 1950s called The Ugly American. But it is the best novel ever written about American foreign policy. And it was written before the Vietnam War. Right. And yet it perfectly captures the ways in which we fail to utilize the attractiveness of the American model, the effectiveness of American diplomats, the way that American businesses can create opportunities and growth in other societies. We know how to do this, we're just not doing it. And it will make everything we try and achieve in the world costlier and less likely to be effective.
And if I may have my chronology mixed up, but I think I'm correct in that Graham Greene wrote his The Quiet American after that novel. It was a better written novel, maybe, but made a little bit of a different point. So everybody go back and check that one out, and you can get cheap on Amazon used, and it's a worthy read. Great. So you've also studied and written extensively on civil-military relations. You talked about your book here at the beginning. Maybe you can weave your expertise with civ-mil relations into this same theme, because in certain respects, what's true about the civilian authority over the military is also true about civilian authority over non-military components of influence and strength. So constitutionally, socially, in a variety of ways, the military requires the support of Americans. This administration has reduced the number of organizations, the amount of effort, the dollars that we are investing in those things. But many of these reductions actually resonate with many Americans, even those of us who have worked in the space. We don't buy into the wholesale cuts, right? But we have criticisms, and you've had criticisms. So can you offer a little bit of an explanation of why those things may resonate with Americans or with many Americans, and how do you interpret it?
So, the United States won the geopolitical lottery. We have Canada and Mexico as our next door neighbors. We have the ability to create a North American platform of labor, of energy, of education. We have the luxury of ignoring much of what goes on in the rest of the world because we will be late to be affected by it. But that doesn't mean, and so if I'm doing my job right, my mom shouldn't have to know who's running Pakistan, right? Because she can spend her time on other things. So it's not a danger that Americans don't tune in to a lot of these things. But what is a danger is that it's Congress's job to tune in on those things and to exercise their Article I responsibilities for not just governance, but for overseeing the governance that the executive branch is doing. And Congress has more often than not, since the end of the Cold War, I mean, you can start with disestablishing the U.S. Information Agency, which was an independent part of our diplomatic constellation that was extraordinarily effective in protecting and advancing American interests. We are, with the way that DOJ was allowed to ransack a lot of the State Department, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and other organizations, we still need the ability to do these things, and we're going to have to claw our way back to a sensible way of doing them. And it's not going to be cheaper, and it's not going to be more effective to, light the building on fire and then figure out how to do the architecture all over again.
Our interim chair of the government department on Veterans Day said something that really illuminates one of your statements here. She said that when the U.S. military, that's a hard thing to measure, when the U.S. military and when these other instruments of national power are doing their job, you don't have anything to measure, right? That you don't have to worry about Pakistan when you're in Omaha, right? That when they're not doing their job or when they don't exist, all of a sudden, now you have something to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, nuclear deterrence works the same way, right? You only know it was working when it fails.
Right.
And I think the same about governance.
So if we can turn to a specific example, because you've written about it and thought about it extensively, and really use it as a lens for these other tools on the far end of the question. The State Department, more than a decade ago, you called for some reformations within the State Department, or maybe even a reform State Department, that could better serve American interests. And you even proposed a plan for that. Is there a connection between your criticisms or former criticisms of the State Department, which we offer as in a constructive sense, right? Not in a negative or cynical sense, because the State Department wields so many of these, or leads the effort on so many of these non-military tools of power. So can you connect your criticisms with American frustration that kind of culminates in support for elimination of USAID and those kinds of things?
So what Paul's referencing is that the best job I ever had in government was as the deputy in the policy planning staff in the State Department. It's a small in-house think tank that works for the secretary. And it's 25 incredibly smart people whose job it is to inject ideas that the broader institution isn't bringing forward. It was so much fun. It was like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, just fabulous all over the place. But what I learned, having my first job in government working in the Pentagon, the American military has a labor force that's the middle of the talent curve. And the institutions array themselves to identify what are the skills that make people good at this, where do we find people with those skills, how do we recruit and retain those people, how do we continue to educate and train them to the increasing responsibilities as their career progresses. The State Department has the most talented labor pool I have ever been associated with, and it dramatically underperforms its talent because the institution does not do any of those things. They assume that people walking in the door have all the skills that they need at any point in their professional development. And it's not true for any of us. And so I wrote an ill-tempered book arguing that we should respect the practice of American diplomacy enough to provide that for the people who put themselves in danger on behalf of our country, namely American diplomats. So a way not to improve American diplomacy is to provide no process of thinking about what do we need and who does it or who should do it and how much money do they need to do it. We didn't do any of those things as the Trump administration ransacked the development agencies and diplomacy. And it's actually it makes us genuinely less safe that it was done in this way.
Would you modify or update your prescriptions for the State Department today?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, USAID was better at budgeting and strategic planning than the State Department was writ large at that point. And now that there's not USAID, there's nobody good at those things in the State Department. And so that's one thing I can think of. Also, the culture of the State Department, the tendency of the State Department is to say, well, the Pentagon's got all the money, and if only we had money, we could be good at this. But I suggest to you, as a countervailing data, that 3 secretaries of state, Colin Powell, Condi Rice, and Hillary Clinton, all increased the budget and increased the Foreign Service by at least 1,000 officers apiece to create a training float, that is, an education pipeline where people stepped out of line responsibilities. In none of those 3 cases did the State Department create an education or training float. That tells you what the culture values, and what the culture values is more of what it's already doing. So that still needs to change.
So if again, now using that as a lens for the rest of instruments of power beyond the military.
Oh, can I say one other thing?
Yeah, of course.
So whenever people complain about the amount of money the U.S. spends on foreign assistance, first of all, it is rounding error. It is not a significant element. People think it's like 20% of the federal budget. It's less than 1%. So this is, in general, good value. But the United States is historically cheap in delivering foreign assistance, right? We don't like our government in that business. That's part of the reason that Americans think it's such a large proportion. But so we are the stingiest developed free government in providing foreign assistance. But the United States is actually the most generous country of providing foreign assistance because of all of the great private sector and philanthropic institutions that give money for this important task. The Gates Foundation, building public health systems in some of the 54 countries on the African continent. All of that good stuff really matters, and we compensate for what our government doesn't do with what our civil society does. And the other thing I would say about America and the world, so I'm only the runner-up in the talent competition in the Schake family. My sweet sister is the communications director of the Walt Disney Company. And whenever I despair and say, we're doing so much damage to America and the world, my sister's like, hold on a minute. Little girls still want to be mermaids. Like, Disney is doing more for the country than Donald Trump is damaging the country. So don't lose faith that we still have regenerative sources of American power in the international order, and she's right.
So can you offer whether it's programmatically or organizationally or just sort of describing some end state, a constructive vision of what the future instruments of national power, non-military instruments of U.S. power ought to look like?
That's a good question. Well, one place I disagree with Secretary Gates, he talked about the importance of strategic communications, and this always brings out the insurgent in me, because we're never going to be good of being either a government or a society that sticks to message discipline, right? That's not who we are. And I think you cannot have a strategy that's successful over time if it cuts against the fundamental political culture of a society. And who we are as a political culture and as a society is a loud, disputatious, diverse group of optimistic people who go out in the world, right? My favorite description of Americans comes from a historian, Bertha Ann Reuter, in 1923. And she wrote, Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace where they came from. That is our beautiful legacy, my friends. And so a strategy that doesn't bank on the way religious communities are a major force in American foreign policy, and mostly a major force for good. Soft power tools like the Rotary Club, right? And high school exchange programs. When President Eisenhower was challenged by the military leadership in 1956 that they needed more money for defense, he countered by saying, no, we need more money for high school exchange programs with the Soviet Union. That, exactly as Bob Gates said, that the American, I'll quote Eisenhower, the role of the American military is to hold dangers in place while what is dynamic about the United States, our culture, our economy, our view of the world, wins the Cold War. And that's what we're not doing enough of. We're not, what has made the time of American hegemony so extraordinary, especially after World War II, is, first of all, no dominant power in history has ever had as much voluntary cooperation as the United States gets from other countries, right? Everybody else, the British, that has been the dominant power in the international order, has had to enforce what they want done. But the United States, because we have a vision that is mutually beneficial, that lets other states help shape the rules of order, other states help enforce the rules of order. No dominant power has ever had that luxury. And we do damage to it at our peril, because the cost of everything else we try and do in the world will get more expensive if we fail that. The second thing that I think is really important about the time of American dominance is that we ourselves aren't afraid of change, right? The technological changes and the social changes that are creating such upheaval in the US and across the world, the risk tolerance of this crazy nation of immigrants that we belong to will make us, well, let me put it differently. When Theodore Roosevelt was president, he went to my great home state of California, and he said, when I am in California, I do not feel I am in the West. California is the West of the West. And the United States now is the West of the West. The problems we wrestle with and argue about aren't uniquely American problems. Governing over diversity is extremely difficult. It's not just difficult for us, my friends. Technology creating such perturbations in the economy, it's not just happening to us, it's happening to everybody. But we're the West of the West. We're the leading edge of what's happening. And the risk tolerance of our society makes us very likely to be the people who figure out the solutions. And we shouldn't be afraid of either of those things.
So Secretary Gates actually started his keynote with sort of a one over the world on where we're at. What are the dangers? Instead, I wanted us to sort of back into it and start with the theme and back into a similar question. He said that it was a very dangerous moment, but unlike others, he didn't say this is the most dangerous moment. We've heard that a lot recently. I think that this is the most dangerous moment that some national security professionals think that they've ever seen. What's your assessment? And if I can actually precede that by saying one of the reasons why I really like hearing from you on things like this is because you always seem measured and not alarmist. And now maybe you'll be an alarmist. I don't know, but I'm really looking forward to your answer. What is your assessment?
First of all, just to be clear, you're
Yeah.
asking me to improve on Secretary Gates' answer?
Yes.
Okay.
I know you can.
So you are right that I always grind my teeth and get agitated whenever, and it is especially true of secretaries of defense, that they have a tendency to say, the world's never been more dangerous, things have never been more challenging. And, Abraham Lincoln would like a word on this subject. Franklin Roosevelt or John Adams would think things look pretty easy for the United States now because we are so powerful relative to the challenges that we're facing. And so, math class isn't newly hard. Math class is always hard. And so, yeah, the world's challenging, but look at it. I mean, China, everything Secretary Gates said is true, but we have probably already seen peak Chinese power. They are marooned in the middle income trap. Per capita GDP in China is $18,000. They are not about to overtake, Palo Alto, California, unless we let them. So China can't make the political decisions that are needed to propel them to continued success. And for all of the craziness of American society, the sources of dynamism in this country are amazing and almost impossible to destroy, despite not just this administration, but many administrations impeding that. Second thing, Russia, the vaunted Russian military, has been fought to a standstill by a smaller Soviet-style military than the Russians for the last 3 years. I don't mean to denigrate the incredible grit, adaptation, and courage of the Ukrainian people, but Poland would win a war against the Russian military. Finland would win a war against the Russian military. There's no doubt that the 32 countries of the NATO alliance would win and quickly in a war with Russia. So, mostly what we should be afraid of is not the challenges the rest of the world is posing for us, but the dumb, self-indulgent stuff we do to ourselves.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. How about tariff policy, right? How about being meaner to our friends than we are to our actual enemies?
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you. So, turning to your scholarly side, right? Your scholarly background. I'd like to propose for the moment that our institution of education and scholarship, so universities, professional military education institutions, service academies, think tanks that are really think tanks, not advocacy tanks, they're in their own way an instrument of national power, right? It's what a great story that your policy proposals
getting plagiarized.
Right. That's exactly that's sort of the idea, right? It's that great people with experience and scholarly capacities can stop for long enough to produce something thoughtful that for those who are caught up in the grind of public service, important grind of public service, they can pick something up that's thoughtful and put it to use, right? That's the idea. So I'd like to propose that as a sort of instrument of national power in a sense. And you clearly...
I agree. The great thing about the American government is how porous it is to outside influences, to ideas that people have to improve. And this deep strategic culture of the United States comes from the fact that several thousand people like me in universities and think tanks think we are the government in waiting and can improve on what our government's doing and catapult that into the debate all the time.
If I could have you address one of the concerns, particularly I think at the moment, and I'm not sure we use the term elites or elitist, but there's concern that this is sort of an elitist activity, and in some cases maybe that's a fair assessment, but it's not intended to be. Can you talk about maybe what is the sweet spot for this kind of contribution in a country like ours?
So I am unapologetically in favor of elites in government. Government is serious business. You know what else is an elitist undertaking? Medicine. Do you want somebody who didn't go to medical school to perform surgery on you? No, you actually want them credentialed by people who are serious about the undertaking. And government is serious business because it affects people's lives. And so we actually ought to have people who are educated to think about these problems, who are dedicated to a sense of contributing to something bigger than themselves and who are willing to be held accountable for their mistakes by the American public. So yes, it's an elitist undertaking, and yes, it should be, because it affects people's lives.
So how does that remain rooted within a constitutional system like ours in a democracy?
Well, first of all, don't elect people who don't think that to public office, right? We are being incredibly reckless right now by treating government as performance art. And we ought to be much more serious about holding our members of Congress accountable for holding the rest of government accountable, right? The brave men and women who built this country thought Congress was the superior branch of governance. And what has destabilized American politics is Congress not exercising its constitutional authorities. Our Congress is performing like we are in a parliamentary system, not like we are in a presidential system. And so hold your members of Congress accountable for anything your government does, because that's what they're there for.
So one last question before we turn to the audience. Here in a university setting, what recommendations and encouragement would you give to the University of Texas, our president, our provost, the faculty, and especially our students who are interested in these kinds of things that you've done, the whole gamut, service, scholarship, etc.?
So I love being a school teacher, and I'm always shocked when I'm in government jobs and people meet me and they either think I'm a ruthless killer or a shameless political hack, because I think it's so obvious I'm a school teacher. And so I will give you a school teacher's advice, which is do your homework, right? That's the way to get good opportunities. That's the way to be able to make a significant contribution when you choose these kinds of jobs. And it's a way to reward the country that has created so many opportunities for all of us to be better than it is at any given moment. Like, that's a noble undertaking. And you get the luxury of doing that work for the country because you did the work that made you an expert in the first place.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We'll turn to the
audience now. Thank you, my friends.
All right. So as before, we've got a couple of microphones that will go around the room, and why don't we start here, Anderson, right here to your right. And if you could, this is not just for you, although you feel like you're in the spotlight right now with the microphone. If you would, please make your questions succinct and with a question mark at the end. Thank you.
So you've been pretty critical of the current administration and their security policy. And I was just wondering, other than the policy plagiarism, are there any areas where you think they're executing or exhibiting good strategy?
So I think my main criticism of the Trump administration is that they're not exercising strategy, right? Their budget doesn't connect to what they say they want to do. They are, I'd love if anybody in the room knows what we are doing on Venezuela that requires the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier and the largest number of ships in the Caribbean since the Spanish-American War. The lack of strategy is dangerous. Where I think they have done a couple of things well. So I don't share Secretary Gates's optimistic view of what's going on in the Middle East, but I do think the Trump administration saw the opportunity that the threats Iran was posing were creating a convergence in the security thinking of the Arab states and Israel, and created ways to formalize and deepen that cooperation. I think that's been beneficial for the region. And then, so that's one thing. But I'm a lot less positive than Secretary Gates is that Israel is perceived in positive terms. I mean, what I hear from many of the Arab countries is that they now view Israel as a rogue state in the Middle East. That's a tough thing to get past. Second tough thing to get past that I don't think the administration's thinking their way through on their big success of the Middle East is I don't see how the ceasefire holds without somebody who's going to disarm Hamas, and nobody's signing up for that task, and who's going to rebuild Gaza. Mostly what I hear from interlocutors in the Arab states is Israel destroyed it, Israel should rebuild it. And unless Israel comes up, as Bob Gates did say, with a positive vision for Palestinian governance, nothing's going to move. So I think even in their area of biggest success, the fact that they are not thinking strategically and resourcing their strategy means that there are lots of ways that trapdoors could open underneath it.
Right here.
Thank you. What is your take on the Hegseth-Trump military brass gathering? You touched upon that earlier, but specifically, what do you think the generals and the admirals in the room took away from it?
So the good news is we have no idea what the generals and admirals took away from it, and that's exactly as it should be, because the 400 military leaders called to heel by the President and Secretary of Defense did exactly what they're supposed to do. I'm the starchy school crossing guard of civil-military relations. And so they had a duty to show up because their civilian leadership told them to, and they had a duty to stay out of the political circus that the president and the secretary created. And they did both of those things extremely well. I think it's more demonstration of governance as performance art that Secretary Hegseth called them there for I don't know what reason, other than to tell people who spent the last 30 or 40 years of their lives on the line to defend this country that they need to shave better and lose weight and somehow focus on lethality, as though that had never occurred to people 40 years in service. So I think every member of Congress who voted for Pete Hegseth's confirmation actually has a lot to answer for. I didn't say a single thing nobody in this place disagrees with. That's so statistically improbable. Come on, people.
Let's go back here. I think, yeah.
Thank you so much for your comments today. I'm curious, what is your view of President Trump's use of personal acquaintances, friends, family members to advance his diplomatic mission with, for example, people like Witkoff or Kushner or others?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at any given time, about a third to a fourth of American diplomats are political appointees. And the State Department hates that. I am much more indulgent of it because I actually think it really matters for somebody conducting American foreign policy to be able to call the president on the telephone. So I don't have any objection to the president's political appointments. I do have an objection to the corruption that many of them appear to be engaged in. That's not a good look for a free country. And also, it makes it harder for our closest friends to cooperate with us because they have legal restrictions on their involvement in corruption. So, if it's easier for the Pakistani government to do business with the United States than it is for Britain, that tells me we're off the mark. But as a general rule, I have no objection to it. I also think it's really beneficial when American political leaders talk to a wide variety. So I don't even have concerns about President Trump, golfing with random people and pulling rabbits out of his hat at the next NSC meeting, because, the system can and should address those kinds of ideas.
All right, back here, Noah, I think is that. Yep, Noah.
Thank you, Dr. Edgar. You've been very critical of this administration, the lack of seriousness, lack of policy. My question is, how deep does the rot go? And I'm talking about specifically the staffers, the think tanks. How deep does this, lack of professionalism go? And I'm going to be very specific and say, if you look at like the Heritage Foundation and their shameful conduct the last couple of weeks, how bad do you think this is? And in a sense, it's not really Hegseth, but more the staff is not really restraining him.
So the good news is that the Pentagon is an enormous bureaucracy of 3 million or so Americans, and it takes a long time to actually change an organization that large. I have been watching quite closely, so the 17 or so 3- and 4-star officers who have either been fired or forced to retire by Secretary Hegseth. I've been watching who gets appointed to replace them. Because if uniformed officers are behaving in a partisan political way in order to be selected for those top jobs, that would be a really dangerous precedent. I haven't yet seen any evidence that that's happening. But I see my friend Kelly Magsamen, the former chief of staff to the secretary, is here. She may have a different view. But it seems to me that it's very hard to change a big organization. The same is true of most parts of the American government. And doing it by, threat of execution isn't the best way to motivate people to take initiative. And so I think it is likelier to be the case that things stop happening than that too much happens as Secretary Hegseth and Secretary of Health and Human Services and others try and radically reshape the American government. So I'm pretty hopeful that bureaucracy, which exists to create a floor of acceptable behavior, is holding and can hold, and that the American system of government has enough built-in checks and balances, court overviews of policies, that will slow the pace of many things that I personally believe to be dangerous that the administration's undertaking.
Great. Let's stay over on this side of the room for a couple more. Right here in the middle.
Thank you, Dr. Edgar. I had a question specifically on China policy. You mentioned that China is not going to overtake Palo Alto. We're not going to get China with the new Silicon Valley, like that sort of thinking. My question relies specifically on their population, right? They have roughly 20% of the world population, basically 4 times the US population. How does that play into how you think on China policy?
Okay, I so love that you asked that question because it gives me the opportunity to brag about somebody else on my ball club, the great demographer Nick Eberstadt. He has a piece out that I encourage you to see about the demographic collapse of China. It is true that currently China has 4 times America's population. A generation from now, we may be a larger country than China. Partly because of immigration to the United States, which we ought not to be an impediment to, and also because of the one-child policy in China China is going to grow old before it grows prosperous. And that's going to be an enormous problem for a government whose social compact with its people is limited political liberty in return for prosperity. As the prosperity side of the equation slows, I continue to think that Frank Fukuyama is still right. He just hasn't been proven right yet.
Right. One more on this side of the room, closer to the front. Right here, actually in the front row. Oh, hi, Damon.
Hi, thank you so much. I would love to hear your thoughts about what to call our current era. There's wide agreement that the post-Cold War era is over, the unipolar moment is over. What do you call a current era, or do you think there is any value in that exercise of finding a label to encompass everything?
Okay, I love that question, and I do not have a good answer to it. I'm a little bit, so a Stanford historian has an essay in The Economist right now talking about our moment as a second Gilded Age. And that has a certain appeal to me, but it doesn't quite capture the technological ferment of our moment. That feels like the defining characteristic for me. That's what's driving economic inequality. That's what's driving anxiety about labor. That's what's driving how we communicate politically and interpersonally. So there'd have to be okay, here's my challenge to the students in the midst. Think about the answer to this question and make Professor Edgar run a sweepstakes with a prize for the person who comes up with the good answer to that.
We'll do it. Will you help judge the answers?
Oh, I'd love to.
All right, we'll do
Yeah.
it. We'll do it. Great. Let's come back over here to this side of the room. I think we have room for probably one more question.
No, I've stomped out all dissent. Fantastic.
All right. We did have another arm over here, but okay. All right. Yes, sir. Last question. Here, yes. We'll get you a microphone here in a second. Sorry, wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Thank you. You've said some pretty challenging or tough things about the current processes, et cetera. We got 3 years left in this administration, whatever, however you look at it. How do we convince the American people that maybe there are better ways to do things, and this is not the exact process, whether you're Republican or Democrat? How do we go forward?
So I think we actually already are going forward. I don't think we should lack confidence that my mom has the judgment to sustain the republic, right? Like if you look at people's reactions to policies in the first Trump administration, when President Trump was elected in 2016, his the three driving ethos of how President Trump thinks about the world, that allies are a burden on the United States, that tariffs take American jobs, and that trade takes American jobs and that immigrants take American jobs, right? So it's the lump of labor fallacy. There was widespread support for those three ideas in 2016. 2 years later, when people saw the policies, support had dropped more than 15% for that. So I don't think we need to worry that Americans lack the judgment to behave in their own self-interests. I also think one of the ways that this moment feels so fraught is that President Trump and the people around him are pushing the boundaries of executive authority, and they're moving very fast to do it. And it has outpaced the courts and civil society's ability to organize and to contest those. But those are coming along. I mean, it looks to me like the courts are very actively defining executive space. We may not like what they are defining, but they are defining it. And because I am a sweet, sunny summer child and an optimist, I actually think the long-term result of President Trump's second term is likely to be a much more constrained role for the President of the United States, because we're going to rewrite the Insurrection Act. There are a whole lot of things that sloppy legislation that's been on the books for 100 years because people like me, including me, lacked the imagination to think of a chief executive who would so aggressively assert those edge power issues. And we have the ability to fix it. I really am always surprised when people think that the American government, which was designed by geniuses in order that it could be run by idiots, I so wish that were original to me, my friends, but it's actually Herman Wouk, the novelist, in Mutiny on the Bounty, describes the United States Navy that way, as designed by geniuses to be run by idiots. But why do we think that a governance structure that has served us so well in so much change across 250 years does not have the ability to adapt to the current challenges? I don't think we should lose faith in that. We're actually pretty good at this once we can be roused to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it. And I think that's what civil society and all sorts of parts of the American public are doing now. Thank you, my friends, for the pleasure of having this conversation.
Great. Thanks so much.